Hey guys, Tom Zutaut here at Can You Get Me In? And we are in a special place tonight. And first thing is, I got to tell you, last week's episode, I talked about the fires out in California, and my heart goes out to everybody that's dealing with some kind of loss, their property, family members, pets. I mean, I, I never could have imagined anything like this ever happening. But I did talk about it last week and about the I called it the 91 fire, but I just want to tell you it was actually November 3rd of 1993. I don't know how I couldn't remember that day because it was a few days after Halloween, and I'd had one of the greatest Halloweens ever with my daughter. Jurassic Park was like roaring, the first movie, and we were dressed up like dinosaurs for Halloween. But anyway, and then the next morning, right after I filmed, I read about how Bob Clearmountain's studio and house had burned down. And I was literally shattered because it reminded me that in the 93 fire, I had lost my digital master tapes of Bob Clearmountain's mixes of Use Your Illusions 1 and 2. And as I read and looked at the pictures at Clearmountain's place, I wonder if he had rescued his copies because, hopefully these exist somewhere in the world because it'd be great to hear them again. And, not a lot of people heard them. Anyway, I wanted to make that correction.
So can you get me into that circle that you're talking about?
Ben, you're sitting next to me. You're already in, man. You know, um,
We're in cahoots.
yeah. So this is Ben VanderHart. He is the owner of Yellow Racket Records, and we are on the stage at Yellow Racket Records right now. And just a little background, I was doing reporting for the rock radio station in town, KZ 106, and that's how I met Ben, coming into his store for doing some promos for Record Store Day. And we get together every now and then, and we always learn from each other. So I thought it would be awesome because even though Ben started in 2018 with an independent record label and put a record out of his own and then signed some other artist, and 2 years later, here he is with a bricks and mortar store. But I thought it'd be fun for us to talk about the music trends of 2025.
Yeah.
So there is this trend towards acoustic music. And in fact, later tonight, Lizzy Hale and her lead guitar player, and they're a couple for the last 10 years, they're playing around the corner at the Signal, and they're doing a unplugged storyteller concert. So you got Hailstorm, probably the last of the sort of harder rock bands to break through traditional, radio and, video means, they were kind of at the tail end of it. But anyway, it's interesting to me. And, what are your thoughts in dealing with all the customers you have in your
Yeah.
label about this acoustic music trend?
It kind of makes me think about the MTV Unplugged days. I mean that was huge. You had, and I still have people asking me for these albums all the time. That Nirvana Unplugged, the Pearl Jam Unplugged, Alice in Chains Unplugged. Like everybody had to do an unplugged session on MTV back in the 90s, and those records are still really popular.
Yeah, and on that note, I'm literally, I don't try to take credit for a lot of things, but I am the guy who started Unplugged. And it actually started with Tesla. And this is a really crazy story. So we had this idea to do an Unplugged record with Tesla in Philadelphia. God, what was the theater? Tower Theater? I can't remember the name. But anyway, we did this cover of this old five-man electrical band song, Signs, and it became this big hit. And simultaneously, while we were doing unplugged things with Tesla, I was also doing unplugged things with Guns N' Roses. In fact, one of the legendary Guns N' Roses concerts was a New Year's Eve unplugged show at the Cat House, which was Ricky Rackman's thing, and he later went. But so we started advertising all these unplugged GNR shows, the Tesla Unplugged show. And by the way, Jimmy Page is in an interview stating that the Tesla Unplugged record is one of his favorite records of all time, and that it
wild.
takes a great guitarist to play an acoustic and an electric like Frank Hannon. So I figured that I would share that. But yeah, it's like this unplugged thing. So I look at it like you just said. I look at it like, well, we did this 20 years ago, and now it's kind of recycling back with Lizzy Hale and her guitar player. And what other unplugged things have you seen come through lately?
I think my gut tells me that anytime you have like a huge trend in one direction, there's always going to be sort of a recoil, a correction, pendulum swing back the other way. And, the last 10, 15 years, we've definitely been seeing, electronic beats and like very, very highly synthesized music has been the top of the charts, just dominating. And you can't spend, as a musician, you can't spend more than 5 minutes on social media without getting advertisements for buy my beats. I've got a beat making company, this beat production, right? It's like, right. So it to me it seems natural that you'd have sort of this correction similar to sort of going from big anthemic stadium rock in the late 80s to having these bands saying, well, what if we just strip it all back, like pull it all back, right? Yeah. Well, no, I mean, just for a band like Tesla, or for bands like Alice in Chains and Pearl Jam and Nirvana to say, we're going to strip it all down. We're going to do the opposite of this really heavy, aggressive. We're going to do that, but we're going to. So I think it makes sense that if people are getting their fill of electronic music, that there's sort of an inclination to say, well, what's the on the other side of the coin here? Like, and leaning into, we're seeing, country music is becoming incredibly popular again. I think especially in large credit due to Casey Musgraves, having a huge breakout album and winning a Grammy several years ago for Golden Hour, and a lot of other people saying, I'm going to make my country album, and
even Beyonce, right?
Sure, yeah,
her version of Jolene.
Yeah, I mean, Post Malone did a country album this year, and Gwen Stefani did a country album. Ringo Starr just put out a country album, and yeah.
So country, is it? I mean, is it simplified? I mean, is it because country is making all the money these days? Everybody, I mean, I'm trying not to be too cynical about it, but really, unplug, strip down. I mean, I remember when I used to drive down to Redondo Beach, where Don Dokken lived, and every Dokken song, Breaking the Chains, Alone Again, Dream Warriors from the Nightmare on Elm Street movie, like that stuff all started on the side of Don Dokken's bed on an acoustic guitar.
Yeah.
And if it sounded great stripped down, it's going to be great, whether it's bended country, heavy metal, wherever, it's like the basic of a song. And so maybe this trend is that, people have been flooded with all these beats and, like four songs borrowed, merged into one song with like a new chorus on it.
Yeah.
Maybe this is sort of the reaction, like you said, to sort of swing back to something maybe a little simpler. So one of the other trends is this genre bending. And I mean, I've always been bending genres. I grew up on country music. My dad was playing me the original Hank Williams, the one, from the late 50s. So, and then, I'm listening to like Jimi Hendrix, MC5 Kick Out the Jams when I'm like 10 years old. And, and then I'm going, Dad comes home and, we're listening to Dolly Parton and Hank and, some that, most people, Ferlin Husky, and I mean, all this stuff. So, but there is this trend and it's been identified. And I think, somebody could listen to a country star and then play Metallica, like what do you see like in your store?
Yeah. It's funny because I have these shirts hanging up behind the counter that say indie is not a genre, and really from the beginning of the store we never cared very much about genre as a store. And in fact, you'll find if you go out and look on the racks, there's new records and there's used records, but we don't split by genre very much. And I think it's because so many young people these days don't care that much about genre. And I honestly, I listen to so many different genres that I think for me, and it started out as a practical thing, right? It's like we had a small collection when we started. It doesn't make sense to divide a small collection into 20 different subsections, right? So we simplified it and sorted by artist. But even now, like when I go home and I'm looking through my record collection, I sort by artist at home, you know. I do split out my jazz records. I might split out my soundtracks, my classical. But when it comes to pop and rock and hip hop and, you know, punk, like it's all sorted by artist because I bounce so much between artists. And I think a lot of young people are the same way.
So have you been genre bending your taste in music like for a long time?
Well,
Like personally?
yeah, I mean, I think when I was a kid, you know, growing up listening to the radio station, and we've talked about this before just in conversations that like that was so much a part of your identity. You know, you'd meet somebody and it's like, oh, what kind of music? Do you listen to the country station? Do you listen to the rock station? Do you listen to the hard rock station? Do you listen to the top 40 station? Right? And it was like that was a big part of like your identity and the crowd that you wanted to roll with. And now that you know, now that people have so much freedom with streaming to just choose whatever they want to listen to, I think people are less tied to a particular genre, you know, as a part of their identity.
Yeah. Well, I know the first time I came in here for that radio thing, I was going through the bins and I was like, where do I find Tesla here? You know,
Right.
and I noticed right away that everything was alphabetical, and you know, I think maybe jazz is separated in you know in soundtracks maybe, but you know, it kind of annoyed me at first, but you know, when I came in the next time and the time after that and the time after that, I was like, oh, this is kind of cool because I do have a diverse taste in music and it's all like alphabetized, and I kind of liked it. And you know, the other trend is this personal music experience. And, you know, I take that to mean that because of streaming and creating your own playlist, it gives you the opportunity to just sort of create whatever kind of music experience you want.
Yeah.
And, you know, Jack FM was the first sort of radio format to go all over the map. But now, you know, here in town, you know, we have the harder rock station and the classic rock station, and a lot of times, you know, they're both playing the same things. But I think that probably one of the greatest examples of this genre bending, and you know, concert tickets are so expensive now. It's almost like you can't justify the expense of going to see one or two bands on the same stage, you know, for 6, 7, 8, $900. You know, if you buy a ticket to Coachella or to Bonnaroo or something like that, you know, you can see tons of bands on a bunch of different stages over the course of a few days. It seems like a much greater value. But this year is the 23rd year of the Bonnaroo, and they announced it a few days ago. And I was looking at it and I was thinking, this is unbelievable. So you've got, you know, one night is Luke Combs, Dom Dalla, and Insane Clown Posse. I mean, it couldn't be anything like more genre bending on one night than that. And then the next night you got Tyler, the Creator, and the Glass Animals. And the night after that, you've got Olivia Rodrigo and Avril Lavigne. And the last night, it's Hozier Vampire Weekend. And somewhere stuck in all of that genre bending, you're going to have Queens of the Stone Age and Megadeth. So,
yeah,
I mean, it just blows my mind that you could have a festival with those many different kinds of artists. And I think it's kind of an experiment for Bonnaroo, but the booker must have read this trend and thought, you know what? I think the best way for me to sell 4 days of music is to genre bend and you know go for the 20-somethings that are
have
genre
something
bend.
for everybody, right? Yeah, it's something I say all the time about the record store here. Is like I want to have something for everybody. You know, a lot of record stores will sort of you particularize or you know specialize in you know it's like we specialize in punk and you know metal, or we specialize in jazz, or you know. But in a town like Chattanooga, that's not real big. You know, I want to make sure that there's a little bit of everything for everybody, and you know, kind of backtracking a little bit, like we were talking about. I love that somebody will come in and they might be looking for Bob Dylan, but they'll go past, Miles Davis and Dr. Dre on their way there, And I think that for the most part, our listeners, people who are really passionate about music, have pretty eclectic tastes. They're pretty widely listened, and so they don't mind that, And so I think a lot of people are going to be going to these festivals, and they're going to be seeing. They're not just going to pick the rock bands or just pick the. They're going to be seeing a little bit of everything while they're there.
All over the map.
Yeah.
And my favorite thing is so I worked with this new band, and they didn't really have a lot of success, but they were like heroes in Kentucky. They were called Johnny Conqueror, and they were in high school. They weren't even out of high school yet, and they reminded me of the early Yardbirds. But here were these like 16 and 17-year-old kids sounding like the first Yardbirds album, from '63 or '4 or whenever it was, and one day, all these kids were talking about the greatest thing that they'd ever seen or heard in their life was King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard. Yeah. And so I'm looking at the Bonnaroo. I mean, it's hard to remember King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, but I'll bet these 20-somethings can't forget it. So I can't be in a record store, without browsing the bins. And so, yeah. I'm browsing the bins, and I mean, it's like they're in brown paper bags. But here are the King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard albums, and what's really cool is that you have these records, firstly, and secondly, they're going to play 3 sets across 3 different stages on 3 of the 4 days, and it's called the Rue Residency. So I think if I went to Bonnaroo, the thing I'd want to see the most would be the Rue Residency. I'd want to see this band that these 20-somethings 5 years ago told me was the best thing they'd ever seen or heard in their life. And every subsequent session I had with them, they were talking about one of the songs by this band. Like, I mean, I can remember being obsessed by Led Zeppelin like that, or The Who, or the Stones, but these kids were obsessed by King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, and now the Rue Residency will be at the Bonnaroo. I'm like tempted to go just to see them play 3 different sets of music. I'm curious, but the real question is, why not just have them do 4 sets on all 4 days?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
They've been one of our top selling artists every year for the last,
kidding me?
4 years probably since we've been open. And you talk about genre bending, like this is like the most prolific band in the world. I mean, just
well, how many records they put out?
Oh, it's got to be. I mean, it's got to be 20 studio albums, and they've only been. And there was one year, and I want to say it was 2018, 2019. 2018, I think they put out 5 albums in 1 year, 5 studio albums in a single year. And these guys have, they'll put out a psych rock album, they put out a heavy metal album, like really heavy. Not just like, we're talking heavy metal, right?
Wow.
And then they'll have like a kind of this like electronic pop thing. Going on.
So they literally are
a jam band. They've got the jam
a defining moment for a jam band and a genre bending band.
Yeah.
Well, I can say these high school kids were obsessed by them, and that's how I became aware of them. And I did not know any of that. And I'm sure that people are going to be curious and check it out, and maybe end up at the Rue Residency.
Yeah.
But even Bonnaroo, it started as a jam band festival. And then in their second year, the first year was 2002, in their second year in 2003, they did a whole New Orleans music jam, and New Orleans bands and artists, and the ones that marched down the street at funerals, and Dr. John, and all this cool New Orleans stuff. And so from that to what we just talked about, that is just crazy. So what I remember is... to me, the first time I kind of like was shocked on this whole notion of genre bending is when, Guns N' Roses reform. They do their like big comeback tour in stadiums, and Chris Stapleton is going to open for Guns N' Roses, at the Nissan Stadium in Nashville. And I was like, I wonder what's going to happen. I mean, these GNR fans are probably going to throw stuff at Chris Stapleton, but
right.
I mean, he brought back the roots of country music almost single-handedly. It's unbelievable that they would do that. And everyone I talked to that went to that show said it was like the greatest show ever, and that they thought that Chris Stapleton should have opened on the entire GNR tour. That's
Yeah.
how well it went down. Um, Now, when I started, um, I was back on Sunset Strip in like the early 80s, late 70s, early 80s. And music, you had a tribe you belonged to, right? So there was no genre bending. It was like, you were in a tribe and, you put your war paint on and you dressed a certain way. And it really manifested on Sunset Strip. It was almost like that old black and white movie, The Ride on Sunset Strip. Like, there were punks that were there to see X in Fear. By the way, a lot of people don't know this, but I brought X to Elektra Records, and Ray Manzarek produced him from the Doors, and I did a lot of stuff with the Doors, and I've talked about that in the past. But anyway, X in Fear, and so I mean, we're talking like switchblades, chains, leather jackets with chains and punk on the back, mohawks, and all this stuff, right? So they were in one club. Another club was like the Van Halens and the traditional hard rock bands. And then all of the boys dressed like girls that were like, these punks called them sissies, like the Motley Crue fans,
right.
The Poison fans.
Yeah, the spandex.
And all the spandex. And then you had the New Romantics at the same time, like Spandau Ballet and Duran Duran. And, so there were 4 tribes competing for space on the Sunset Strip. And sometimes the LA County Sheriffs had to come in, close off the strip, and get between the 4 different tribes that were trying to beat the shit out of each other. Yeah, it was like West Side Story, It was just crazy. And then, you started getting into festivals, right? And the festivals were genre specific. The Warped Tour was kind of like all the K-rock bands, as they call them. The Ozfest, hard rock and metal.
Yeah.
Lollapalooza was like these edgier alternative bands like Jane's Addiction.
Right. Yep.
Perry Farrell started it. And then, you had all the European festivals that were primarily all metal. I'm going to be curious to see if these European festivals are going to genre bend like Bonnaroo and Coachella. But I don't know how that'll go. Donington was traditionally just the UK heavy metal festival.
Yeah. Yeah, it's it reminds me of like the Breakfast Club. You know what I mean? It's just like in the 80s, it was like, who are you? A punk? Are you a jock? Are you a cheerleader? Are you a brainiac? Like, whatever. It was very, and you had to dress a certain way so that people could identify you as being part of that tribe. And I'm amazed constantly at the people who come in to the store and they'll be dressed one way, and then just the records they bring up to the counter are like, well, that's not what I was expecting,
So you can't tell anymore by what tribe people are in, and they dress a certain way. You think they're in a certain tribe, and then they buy records the opposite.
Right, you'll have people come in and young girls, and you think, well, maybe they're coming for the Taylor Swift records because everybody in that age group wants Taylor Swift these days, and they'll be like, where are your Misfits records? And you're like, well, I didn't see that coming.
Wow, has anybody bought a Misfits and a Taylor Swift record at the same time?
Yeah. I mean, I would say almost certainly. I mean, it's wild. I will say, I feel like one of the most complimentary sort of record pairings that we're seeing a lot these days is people will pick up like metal and country. So you talk about like the Chris Stapleton and Guns N' Roses combo, and it's like, that makes sense because I have people coming in here all the time.
That makes sense to you?
Yeah, well, because of how often I see people come up to the checkout and they've got Sabbath and Sturgill Simpson, or they've got Tool and like Tyler Childers, and or like Willie Nelson and Corrosion of Conformity or whatever.
I'm telling you, like Sturgill Simpson and Tyler Childers and Chris Stapleton. I mean, to me, they brought back what I loved about country music.
Right, yeah.
I'm not a fan of Beyonce trying to do it, but my wife and my stepdaughter, they both like Jolene. In fact, they made me listen to it in the car, and I was like, ah!
Not your jam, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I'd rather hear Dolly do it.
You're not walking around the strip with a cowboy hat on?
Yeah. Oh, I got a cowboy hat that I'm not ready to wear it on a horse yet. Anyway, so while we're talking about festivals, let's talk about the grandfather of the big festival, which would be Coachella.
Mm.
And it kind of started out more on the rock end, and now it's a real hodgepodge. But this is, at least one of the things I hope as Bonnaroo genre bands, I hope that people go there to listen to the music, right? Because the one thing I found about Coachella in the last few years is there's more people with their phones out posting on social media, and it's like you got the tribes there. You got these like groups of people, and they're all trying to be seen, and everybody's posting on what so and so wore that day, and it's celebrity watching. And I'm like, man, I used to go to music festivals to hear the music. And I mean, I don't mind talking to my friends between the songs or like, hey, this song's killer. But I mean, they're just showboating out there on Coachella now. And I mean, it's still like the festival of all festivals. And, I mean, I know the guys that started it, and, I'm friends with them. And I'm just amazed at what it's become and how it's such this. It's like there's channels talking about it when it's running all the time.
It's like red carpet vibes kind of thing.
Yeah.
Everybody's like, sort of doing the fashion walk, doing the showboat. Yeah, trying to get in the spotlight a little bit.
All of that. And, the other thing I've noticed, and this is another trend, I think, is that the club business was almost killed by COVID, right? And so people were kept out of clubs for 3 or 4 years. And a lot of clubs almost went under. And now, I see it, when I go to Chicago. I see it when I go to LA. I see it when I go to Detroit. Clubs are on the rise. Like, when they say that personal music experience, one of the things I take from that is that a personal music experience is going into a small club with a few hundred people in it, 100 people in it, and experiencing some kind of music that you like. And just even in Chattanooga, there's probably 5 or 6 new clubs in the last year and a half. And, I've seen the same thing in the local music free papers that are on street corners. I'm like, what's that club? What's that? And, there seems to be a rise in people wanting to have a more intimate music experience, which I like.
Yeah. I think too, like the more that our world's kind of become like globalized, and we sort of are constantly getting pulled into national headlines and national artists. Again, we talk about sort of corrections or like pendulum swings. I think, I personally, and I know a lot of people who are like-minded, like me, who feel like, I kind of want to start living a little smaller, right? I can't always be spread this thin. I can't spread my attention across the entire globe and ignore the people who are living next door to me and the bands who are playing in my town. So I think, there's a lot of people now who are maybe trying to divert their attention away from social media a little more and trying to live in real tangible ways, like buying vinyl records again, right? And saying, how can I sort of shrink my attention and shrink my life to be a little more community focused and be going to little clubs and buying records and all these things in small restaurants and bars.
Thus the personal music experience, and maybe what you just said and what I said is sort of part of that. And it's why there are new clubs opening. And a few years ago I thought clubs might be in danger of completely disappearing. So I have a question for you, Ben. Is music changing the people, or are people changing the music?
That's a really tough question. I think that those things are always happening hand in hand. I think that the threat is the world that we live in is we're sort of constantly being bombarded with advertisements. And so there are a lot of people who just sort of, whether they realize it or not, they're just sort of doing what the advertisements tell them, and they're just sort of following like whatever music and movies and books the richest people are paying for me to see. Like that's, what me and my friends are going to be into. But you're always going to have people who are sort of like reacting against that and saying, well, I'm not satisfied with just, I don't know, following the mainstream or whatever. And I think every big movement in music, whether rock music or hip hop, they all started much more as grassroots kind of movements that, nobody in corporate offices was expecting to take off. But guys like you working in A&R would go find somebody that you really cared about, and probably a lot of people didn't believe, like, oh, that's not going to work, right? Like, but you saw something there. You believed in that band. You think of bands like Nirvana or REM, and bands that really sort of changed the face of rock, massive trends, and they came from like pretty small, humble beginnings. So I think we see a lot of sort of, we're fabricating and sort of trying to create a formula in a studio or in an executive office somewhere of what we think is going to sell, but there's always these sort of like counter cultural kind of movements, and people are constantly looking for that because they want to have some say in like where the music is going to go.
Well, I think that's a good explanation for the now and the then. And, you know, there were a lot of skeptics about Motley Crue when I first signed them. Even the label I worked for, you know, told everyone it was like a third-rate Kiss that would never go anywhere, and here they are still selling out stadiums,
Yeah.
all these years later. But I think that the business is, it's really changed, and I think we forget in an era where AI is pushing out a lot of the streaming, that it's using algorithms that, okay, this is really popular. What else is like that? And, I think it really makes it harder for, now versus then on artists breaking through. I mean, 30 years ago, you could still be a pioneer and, you could find a band like Nirvana or Guns N' Roses, and you could, get out to radio stations and MTV and, beg, plead, borrow, and steal for them to give them some exposure. And today, I think it's a lot harder. Like if the next Nirvana or the predecessor breakthrough Guns N' Roses, and you know, I mean, after Nirvana and Pearl Jam and Soundgarden, I mean, what do you have after that? Mainly one-hit wonders, except for, we talked about Lizzy Hale and Nottinger, her lead guitarist, doing this unplugged thing tonight. But Hellstorm is probably the last sort of harder rock band that broke through and made any noise um, through any kind of traditional sense of the record business. Um, and I wanted to sort of get into like, because you have an indie label. So, I mean, through all this artificial intelligence, how do you break through with something different? How do you get exposure for it? Because, radio's mainly playing oldies. I mean, unless you're, the next Olivia Rodrigo, or there's a new a female artist out there, Sarah Carpenter, and I mean,
Sabrina
Carpenter.
Yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate
yeah.
that. You've probably seen the record cover, but I mean, I just read the name, and I'm like, and then of course all the country stuff, Hardy, and I mean, Post Malone doing country now, like you said, and I mean, it's if it's not country, how do you break through these days? How do you develop? What do you do, Ben?
Man, I don't think I have an answer. I'm still trying to figure it out, I always joke like it's much easier to sell Beatles records than Telemonster records, which is, my band, right? And that was part of the reason that we started the record stores, because, I mean, that was still a harebrained idea to a lot of people, but it was like, well, this is still more stable than trying to run a record label. And a record label, people are so distracted these days. It's so hard to get people's attention because there's so many people fighting for that attention and paying for that attention on social media and whatnot. More and more social media companies want you to pay. Even if you have 10,000 followers, they're gonna like, well, we'll show your post to 1,000 people, and if you want more than 1,000 of your followers to see it, you got to pay, right? So it is definitely a challenge, but I still, in my heart, I believe that if the music is good enough, then that's the most important thing. And if you work hard and the music is good enough, and you stick with it for long enough, then then the truth will out, right, as they say. I think that you can buy and you can gain faster followers if you sort of play the game and follow the algorithm. And I see people out there, it's like, oh yeah, if I post 3 times a day and I do 10-second, like, short form videos on TikTok or Instagram, whatever, and suddenly they've got 300,000 followers. But the thing about building fires is that if you build a fire with grass, it burns really fast, and it burns up really quickly and disappears. And I think that people who are going to have like the longevity and long-term success are the bands who are going to be working their asses off for a long time and building fans slowly. Because if you build a fire slowly and you're burning wood and you've got really engaged people in your fan base, then like that's what stays, right?
That's an interesting. I mean, I think that is one of the greatest perspectives I've heard. I totally
Oh,
agree
thank
with
you.
that in a sense that, I mean, so nobody would play Motley Crue, right? Nobody would. So, it was kind of like now where those formats and mediums where you could get mass exposure don't exist. And if you're not in the algorithms burning that quick fire with 10-second shorts, and then what does it really mean at the end of the day? It's like the old fashioned way now versus then. To me, if you're good, you got to have a good live show. You got to get out there and play in front of people. And the only shortcuts we could take back then, and there aren't a lot of bands to do this with anymore, but Ozzy Osbourne is like hotter than a pistol on fire. So what do? You get Motley Crue on the Ozzy tour, and literally 300 people out of those 20,000 people would go the next day and buy Shout at the Devil, tell their friends, play it for their friends. And, after that tour started, we went from like, 10,000 records to like 500,000 overnight before the tour was over, and there was no radio airplay, So I kind of look at it, all right, clubs are on the rise. So maybe, there's a comeback for live music with more clubs opening, people wanting that more personal experience that you mentioned, about, people talking to their neighbors and, maybe going to a club to see some music. And maybe the now and then is some of the things from the then will work today on that kind of a level. But you can't just buy your way there. You're going to have to slog it through the old fashioned hard way. The only thing, and this I think is a direct result, and it's kind of interesting, is that comedy seems to have a way to explode on social media. And so it's like you could post something, a band with your music, but it could be kind of boring. What are you gonna light a church on fire and put yourself on a cross in front of the church, like a country artist did recently? Like you got to do crazy stuff to get eyeballs. But for comedians, and again, when people go to post something on social media, the AI picks the soundtrack for it, and it just allows you to be lazy. You don't have to spend an hour searching for the perfect song and cramming your brain to remember it and then search for it. So you post, AI picks the song, boom, 10,000 people watch it, right?
Yeah.
But with the comedians, you could be in the middle of nowhere, in Alabama. You could pick any place in the middle of nowhere, lower Alabama, right? Not LA, lower LA,
Yeah.
lower Alabama. You do something really funny and it catches and it goes viral. And I think, this was another trend, is that comedy was trending up. I mean, the country's so divisive, like a little bit of humor is a good thing. So, but it's easier for new comedians to break through and make some noise. And now you have the comedians writing songs and singing country music. Again, you talked about country music earlier and all the different, everybody's doing something country. So, I'm just saying that, we're in an era where you could have more Steve Martin, King Tuts than anything, because the comedians use original content, right? They're telling a joke, they're doing something silly, even if it's, Steve-O from Jackass. They're doing funny stuff, and that quickly goes viral in entertaining people. So,
and you can consume it so quickly. You can watch a joke in 10 seconds, and that means that you can watch, 10 comedians in 100 seconds, or whatever, right? So Whereas like with music, it's like, am I going to invest 3.5 minutes or 5 minutes to listen to this whole song? A lot of people just, oh, I'm just going to watch jokes, you know?
Right. And then so this comedian becomes really famous, and there's a comedian out there that's like exploded and planning her first tour, and it's amazing. And she's got a country song now, but she built her audience through TikTok comedy skits.
Yeah.
And but again, she wasn't using AI for her audio soundtrack. It's her talking and doing
Yeah.
silly, funny things. And so comedy's trending for 2025, and I think the fact that the comedians are using their original audio of their skits, I think that that's one of the reasons. So we're getting to the zoo thought, and I think I always try to think of something to put out there for people to think about, and I think you started this fire of thought a little while ago, but to me, it's all about the talent, the songwriting, the musicianship, the perseverance, right? It's like if you have the talent, you have the perseverance and the strength to never give up, you can break through no matter what. And I guess what? In order to have a little bit of talent, you also have to have a little bit of ego. And I think that's why, we see a lot of people with ego on the red carpets, because you have to have that kind of confidence to succeed. So I'm going to put it out there. If you're talented and you think you write great songs, and maybe you do write great songs, you got to put not just your neighbors, you got to put good musicians behind what you're doing, and get that stuff heard and never give up.